Russian invasion of Ukraine, 6-month summary. Let's go.
An 8-year-long conflict in eastern Ukraine that started in 2014
I agree with that. This whole thing started in 2014.
escalated into a full-scale war when Vladimir Putin started his unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. More than 6 months have passed since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Most expected the war to be over in several weeks, for Russia to prevail and Ukraine to fall apart quickly amidst the indecisiveness of the West. But Ukrainian resistance, unexpected weakness of the perceived second strongest army in the world, and a strong Western response have created a completely different situation. In this video, we're going to summarize and analyze the Russo-Ukrainian war since its start, and discuss potential developments in the foreseeable future. Please note that the script for this video was written on the 10th of September 2022.
Okay, what you got for us, Kings
After
in
months of
general?
uncertainty, amidst warnings from the United States and the United Kingdom about an impending Russian invasion of Ukraine, on February 24th, Russia attacked Ukraine from 4 main axes, with an estimated 150,000 strong force. Against the capital Kyiv, Chernihiv and Sumy from Belarus in the north, on Kharkiv from the northeast, on the Ukraine-controlled Donetsk Oblast and Luhansk Oblast from the southeast, and against Kherson and Melitopol from Crimea in the south. Russia's official pretext for this invasion, which they called the Special Military Operation, was to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. Russia...
The Putin regime just really want to, like, use denazify as any means to sort of provoke this this attack. It's not a special military operation. The Putin regime has attacked Ukraine, you know?
Russia also claimed that Ukraine has biolabs creating bioweapons, but failed to prove it. Another justification was the possible Ukrainian acceptance into NATO.
That was the biggest problem. They were just so worried. They were so worried about Ukraine joining NATO. That was the biggest fear, because obviously they wanted the buffer state in between them and them and the West. But now by provoking this attack, they've provoked the Ukrainian and the NATO alliance to build stronger and accelerate in its progression, and then also has provoked other countries elsewhere to also join it.
But the alliance doesn't allow countries with territorial disputes to join it.
Putin regime's just really made a mistake.
We have recently learned that in the first few days of the invasion, Ukraine offered Russia to give guarantees of its neutral status, but Putin rejected that, showing that NATO accession was just a pretext. The Kremlin's strategy was based upon an assumption that the Ukrainian government and the military would crumble very quickly. According to the Washington Post investigation,
if they had got to Kiev, if their logistics didn't make such a mistake, then like I definitely think that they would have that could have happened. The government just could have fell.
Putin was misled by his intelligence, which argued that the Ukrainian government was unpopular and that the Ukrainians were going to meet the Russians as liberators. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Despite the decent initial advance of the Russian army, the main prize, Kyiv, stood tall. Buoyed by defiant Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukrainian society refused to give up its...
The man who will now be a martyr for the Ukrainian front. Well, if he ever got killed, he would be a martyr. But he's definitely such a figure now for the Ukrainian defense.
Country
sort of solidified himself
independence.
In the sort of
Ukrainian army was
history
also
of
much
Ukraine
stronger
for now, I think.
In comparison with 2014. Strengthened with anti-tank javelins and NLAWs, it managed to inflict painful losses to the Russian armored force, while withdrawing towards cities in an orderly manner and harassing Russian supply lines. Russian airborne attacks on Kyiv and Kharkiv failed. A 65-kilometer-long mass-armored column of the Russian army advancing
which just got absolutely savage
on Kyiv did not change the tide in the Battle of Kyiv either. The biggest success of the Russian army in the early phase of the war was the capture of Kherson, the only large regional center taken by the Russian army throughout the theater in early March. The Ukrainian government has implicitly taken responsibility for this setback. But why did Russia fail to defeat Ukraine within weeks? Why did Kyiv not fall within 3 to 4 days, as the US government expected?
We all know it was just logistics.
Investigations and analyses of the Russian invasion of Ukraine seem to conclude that Russia did not expect much resistance in Ukraine. The Russian command believed that Kyiv would fall quickly, which would cause a chain reaction all over Ukraine. The fall of the Ukrainian government would break the spirit of the Ukrainian army to fight, and Russia would freely advance, as it did at the start of the conflict in 2014. So when Ukraine offered a spirited resistance, Russia was simply not ready for this. Poor coordination between different military units and branches, inability to conduct major offensive operations, low morale of Russian soldiers, inability to ensure stable supply of the forces at the front line, and a failure to establish air superiority doomed Russia,
like I said, just all logistics. They weren't ready. They didn't think it through.
Into a long, protracted and bloody campaign in Ukraine. Why did Russia fail to have dominance in the air, despite its 1,511 to 98 advantage in combat aircraft at the start? For instance, Harry Boneham of Global Data argued that it was linked with the poor training of Russian pilots, lack of precision-guided munition, which forced Russian aircraft to fly at low altitudes and expose themselves to the Ukrainian air defenses,
So the air defenses were the main things that were holding up the Ukrainians.
Including the Western-provided
holding
Western intelligence
state
support
up
to the Ukrainian army, and unwillingness of the Russian command to risk its costly aircraft against the background of these factors.
No, but the real reason was the intelligence, like he just said then. So that's where he sort of informing me. So the intelligence, and then also the Russians didn't want to commit their force, because they knew that at this moment in time they probably can't replenish them, but surely they'll be able to replenish them.
Early lack of success and unsustainable casualties, especially in terms of armor, forced the Russian command to rethink its strategy and withdraw from the Kyiv, Chernihiv and Sumy oblasts in April 2022, and to focus.
I'm enjoying this little summary and not the sort of slow videos focusing on one area. I enjoy those as well, but this is a nice little sort of recap
on its
for
offensive
me.
in Donbass. Russia simply did not have enough men to continue fighting on all 4 axes. The size of their invading force was planned in accordance with the scenario of a rapid Ukrainian collapse, and when this scenario failed, the Russian command decided to narrow its objective. But military setbacks were not the only blow Russia received at the beginning of the war. Despite initial hesitations, Western countries have imposed painful sanctions on Russia. The most consequential sanctions include freezing almost half of Russia's financial reserves,
Yeah, but they're finding other ways to make their money, and you know, they're finding, even though obviously I know I've got a bit of insight because we're so further on as of when I'm recording this, but obviously they were able to find other ways to still get an income and realize that they don't need to rely on these things that the West had usually used to sort of
connecting
get
major
their
Russian banks from the SWIFT payment system, banning Russian ships and planes from entering Western ports and airspace, restriction in the export of advanced technology to Russia, and import of Russian goods.
But again, they're just finding other ways to get
Russia.
these things, you know.
Along with that, more than
Which made them realise that
1,200
they don't
foreign
need to
companies
rely
have
on the
left
things that they
Russia
were
and
previously.
suspended or restricted their operations there, including Apple, Visa, MasterCard, and so on.
Wix is your platform to perform on.
As a result, Russian GDP had fallen by 4% in the second quarter of 2022, and according to the IMF projection, Russia will lose at least 6% of its GDP by the end of the year. The Russian economy is...
And again, I have a bit of insight, but in the end, as of today, it didn't really make too much of a difference.
From high inflation. Production in many sectors has dwindled, as Russia couldn't import most of the goods it needed to feed its industry. According to Al Jazeera, Russia's car production plummeted by a stunning 61.8% during the first 6 months of this year. But the Russian economy has proved to be less vulnerable to sanctions than it was forecasted, due to an initial rise in energy prices. However, as Russia basically stopped selling oil and gas to Europe, and India and China, who managed to fill their stores, are not buying the oil and gas at the same rate, this process largely stopped, and in August, Russian energy revenues dropped to $11 billion, lowest in 14 months. The Kremlin has also increased government spending, which helped keep the economy afloat. The government managed to keep the ruble relatively stable through different monetary measures, along with keeping inflation under control, as its rate was at 14.9% in August, a 3% decrease from its peak in April.
Wow.
While the Russian economy has definitely suffered and decreased due to Western sanctions, the reports on its death are rather premature. Economists and analysts expect the impact of sanctions to be felt gradually in Russia and in the foreseeable future. But for now,
I definitely thought that it would either be a coup against Putin or the economy would break for Russia. That's how I thought that it was going to go, but obviously we're so far into it that I don't know if that's going to be the case anymore. And obviously it's not in the videos at the moment. We got onto the subject later, but obviously we had the coup with the Wagner group, which I thought was a possibility, and then obviously I thought the economy might have break, but it just doesn't seem like those two things are actually going to do it. The Russian economy is surviving.
Sanctions have had a negative impact on the quality of life of ordinary Russians. It's difficult to know the exact number at this point, but hundreds of thousands of Russians have left the country following the invasion. In the tech sector alone, an estimated 50 to 70,000 Russians have emigrated.
Those are two big numbers. Is that because they're worried about getting conscripted into the forces?
Many Russians whose work is deeply connected to the global economy have had no other choice but to leave. Many others who opposed the invasion have done the same, possibly fearing repercussions for their position.
At this
point, Russia is experiencing a brain drain, the impact of which we will see in the future.
That's something I've never considered, so I'm definitely glad that I've watched the video and Kings and Generals brought that up, because that's something I'm going to sort of think about.
How supportive are Russians of their government's decision to invade Ukraine? Right after the start of the invasion, thousands of Russians took to the streets to protest Putin's decision. But in the absence of an organized opposition, following the arrest of Alexei Navalny and repressions against his anti-corruption foundation that occurred earlier, the Russian law enforcement managed to curb these protests rather easily. After a while,
didn't cause that much of a storm.
Mass protests turned into solitary protests and calls by prominent Russians to stop the war, acts which often resulted in fines, administrative arrests, and all sorts of problems with law enforcement. Usual suspects
you just, in the Russian
were
Putin
Russian
regime,
intelligentsia,
you just didn't want to be in
writers,
trouble with the
journalists,
police.
film directors, actors, and so on. But in a
it's not
somewhat
worth it.
unexpected turn of events, several Russian oligarchs like Oleg Deripaska, Mikhail Fridman, and Oleg Tinkov also called to stop the invasion. Roman Abramovich at some point even acted as a mediator in the failed Russo-Ukrainian peace talks early in the war. Evidently, sanctions are heavily harming Russian oligarchs, particularly those with links to the West, and some of them have voiced their concern. But the general Russian public is supportive of the war in Ukraine. According to polls,
It is. We also got to remember that there's a lot of propaganda within the Putin regime. So yes, they are supportive, but do they actually? I think a vast majority probably think that there are Nazis there, which is obviously not the case. But obviously, when you've got the information, access to information that you do in the Putin regime, it's a bit difficult to sort of get the truth.
Conducted by the independent think tank Levada operating in Russia, 76% of respondents stated their support for the Russian invasion, a meager 5%
That's
drop
because the West
in
is the
comparison
big
with
bad
March.
there because of the Putin
Even
regime.
the continued shelling of civilian areas of Ukraine and evidence of the brutality of the Russian troops did not do much to decrease the support for the war. Some analysts question how firm that support is, and if the Russians are ready to actively support the war effort. Following the Russian withdrawal from the Kyiv Oblast, it was revealed that hundreds of Ukrainian civilians had died in the town of Bucha during the Russian occupation. Even though Russia deflected the blame onto the Ukrainians, whom they accused of organizing a spectacle and a provocation, all the evidence points to a Russian-organized massacre. According to the UN report, as of August,
Was that mentioned on a previous episode? If so, I missed that war
21st,
crime.
5,587 Ukrainian civilians had been killed and 7,890 had been injured since the start of the war.
That's just in general. That wasn't in that one attack, but that's just in general. That's a lot of civilians, brother.
The UN also stated that as of August, 7 million Ukrainians have fled the war. Thousands of Ukrainian children were kidnapped to Russia for adoption. The human suffering caused by the Russian invasion is difficult to measure and account for.
Obviously, we know about the children. I knew about that war crime, but I didn't know about the other one.
But it is clear that tens of thousands have died, millions have fled, and hundreds of villages, towns and cities have been destroyed or heavily damaged since the start of the war.
Those numbers are really solidifying to see them on screen. Those are
following the
some big
failure of the
numbers.
strategy to shock Ukraine into submission. The eastern region of Ukraine, Donbass, which has been a zone of conflict since 2014, became the main focus of the Russian offensive. This prompted the Russian government and propaganda to reinvent their justification of war. Denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine remained somewhere in the background in their messages, while the so-called liberation of DPR and LPR became the emphasis.
Yeah, so he did change it to changing it to those two sort of states.
It seems
But
like
he
at
did
this
just throw the
point, reaching the
denazification
administrative
around.
borders of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts became the minimum program for the Russian command. In mid-April, Russia restarted its offensive in Donbass. The Russian strategy was the usual one, massing an excessive number of artillery in a relatively small area and
Oh, I love
embarking
those
on a massive
animations.
artillery shelling campaign, turning target cities and villages into rubble. At this point, the main advantage of the Russian army over the Ukrainian army was the numerical advantage it had in terms of artillery. This allowed Russia to have its most successful period of the war, between April and early July. Russia made steady progress in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts throughout this period. While Ukraine managed to stabilize the situation on all other fronts, it was suffering in Donbass. The Russian Donbass offensive culminated with the
Now, obviously, we covered a lot of this in the
capture of
videos.
Severodonetsk and Lysychansk by early July. Luhansk Oblast was under complete control of the Russian army, while it continued its progress in Donetsk Oblast. Ukraine's losses in this period were heavy, as in June, Zelensky stated that Ukraine was losing up to 200 soldiers every day. The Ukrainian government
That I also remember from other episodes. Yeah, there's certain bits and pieces I'm remembering, but there's certain bits he's adding through these parts that I'm enjoying.
regularly requested more advanced military equipment to stop the Russian advance, including high-mobility artillery rocket systems, HIMARS. And in June, the United States finally started supplying Ukraine with this system. HIMARS precision fire by 6 rockets has a range of up to 80 kilometers, and this gradually changed the situation on the battlefield.
He's done really good to sort of shorten it down to this short of a video within 6 months, and the animation he's used on this sort of short video is really cool. So I like how he's sort of doing this to try and sort of capture certain people who might just be interested in a shorter video to then be able to sort of go into the rest of the series.
Armed with HIMARS, Ukraine
I like what they're
started
doing
regularly
here.
targeting ammunition and oil depots, as well as command centers of Russia in the rear, destroying the supplies necessary to continue the Donbass offensive. Very soon, Russia's advance came to a halt. Throughout July and August,
Right.
the Russian army tries to advance on Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Bakhmut and Avdiivka, but their gains have been minuscule. Since July 16th, Russia has managed to capture only 450 square kilometers of territory. HIMARS did not only enable Ukraine to stabilize the situation in Donbass,
It just gave
it has
them so
also
much
allowed them to plan
range.
counter-offensive operations with use of the HIMARS in mind. After
Yeah,
months
man,
of
and also
destruction of
the amount of I think he's about to say it now. Do you know what I mean? The amount of damage that they were able to do behind enemy lines to depots
Russian ammunition
and
and oil
stuff.
depots on the southern front, and
Yeah.
key supply points like the Antonivsky Bridge in Kherson,
That's
Ukraine
it.
finally
Supply
launched its
lines,
long-awaited
everything.
counter-offensive. Ukraine has made decent progress in the counter-offensive, which is ongoing as we speak, advancing towards Kherson from 3 different directions. The problem in this for Russia is exacerbated by the difficulty to supply its troops fighting on the western bank of Dnipro in the Kherson Oblast due to the destruction of key bridges. But the most successful Ukrainian counteroffensive was launched in early September in a completely different...
It was, and we covered this in the last episode, and it was just fucking... we try not to swear, and it's just so impressive. So impressive.
Russia has been redeploying its units from the area west of Izium to other directions perceived as more important, which Ukraine has been able to exploit. After sending more troops and military equipment to this area, which the Russian command somehow missed or ignored, Ukraine has conducted its most successful operation of the war yet. Ukraine has liberated Balaklia, most of Kupiansk and Izium, while advancing on Liman. Kupiansk is of a particular strategic importance due to being a key supply hub for the Russian war effort in Donbass, which fell to the occupiers in the first days of the invasion. Russian military bloggers have claimed that their front in Izium has collapsed, and the situation of Russian troops fighting there is dire.
Interesting. So, what's happened to those bloggers?
Ukrainian counteroffensives show that after months of defending and reacting to the Russian movement, Ukraine has managed to capture initiative and momentum on the battlefield for the first time in this war. We should not forget that Ukraine has been the biggest victim of this invasion, as its people
It really is the biggest victim.
continue dying in defense of their country.
But there are people who are fighting for the Putin's regime that don't want to be there and have been fucking forced
While
to.
their cities, infrastructure and
Stop
economy
swearing, Tubby.
continue being destroyed.
Tubby.
But this war has been consequential to so many other countries that we can say it has already had a global impact. With natural gas prices being over $3,000 per cubic meter, a major increase since the start of the war, inflation has become a common problem for Western countries, and inflation has become a significant discontent in the West.
My God, are we still feeling inflation today in the UK? It's ridiculous. Small pack of crisps is like £2. £2. Ridiculous.
For now, European
Tin of beans is like, again, 180. What?
governments are bracing for a difficult winter by enacting austerity measures, and in some cases, unfortunately, going back to environmentally harmful practices like using coal-fired power plants. But experts note that gas storages of most European countries are over 80% full, which should be enough to pass the year without a crisis. The war has also caused a major disruption of
You
international
have a
grain
lot
trade.
of problem using that much
Ukraine
natural
is
gas.
one of the
though,
biggest
right?
grain exporters in the world, and the Russian
I was
control
using
of
natural gas before, so ignore
the
me.
Black Sea caused risks for shipping of grain to international markets. Russia is one of the biggest fertilizer exporters in the world, and in response to sanctions, it restricted their fertilizer exports. This led to fears of global grain shortage, which could have led to starvation in the poorest countries of the world. Thankfully, on July 22nd, Ukraine and Russia agreed to a grain deal, which was brokered by the UN and Turkey.
Yeah, but it doesn't last long, does it?
Russia agreed to deblockade Ukrainian ports and allow grain shipments to go to international markets, while also concurring to restart fertilizer exports. Recently, Putin accused Ukraine of shipping most of the grain to Western countries and threatening to restrain the deal. Another process with potentially disastrous global consequences is related to the Zaporizhian nuclear power plant. In March, Russia captured the power plant. In August, sides started blaming each other for the shelling of the power plant.
Yeah,
After weeks of
this whole
negotiations,
situation's
a visit by an
risky.
IAEA delegation to the power plant was agreed upon. In early September, this study visit was concluded, and the IAEA made quite a neutral statement describing potential risks and calling sides to agree to cessation of all hostilities in the area.
Let me know what
We'll
happens
continue
with that at the
following the
moment.
situation around the Zaporizhian nuclear
What's going
power
on with
plant
that at the
and
moment?
hoping that
I
a
wanna
prudent
know.
solution will be found to this issue. What is
Or if it
next
got
for
resolved.
Ukraine and Russia? For the first time since the start of the war, Ukraine has momentum and initiative on the battlefield. Russia is suffering from a shortage of troops on the ground, as the invasion was planned as a short and victorious campaign. This shortage of troops has reached such levels that even the best Russian unit, the Wagner, has been trying to recruit Russian prisoners to join their mercenary unit. HIMARS is decimating Russian military infrastructure and supplies, and
Aid
has
of
already
the
inflicted
West
significant
coming in
harm on
clutch.
Russian firepower. Russia has tried to respond to these issues by energizing its campaign to hire more contract and volunteer soldiers throughout its vast territory as part of its crypto mobilization efforts. The Russian new Third Army Corps has already been deployed in the most problematic areas of the battlefield, such as northern Donbass, to stop
They're
the
not
Ukrainian
trained,
advance.
and they're not well equipped,
Furthermore,
right?
the Kremlin has adopted measures of economic mobilization, as now the government has a right to order workers of state institutions to work overtime without payment,
So
and
scary. I
order
remember that when that
enterprises
was
to
brought
start
up as
producing
well.
military equipment. But low morale, poor military command, ever-present supply problems, and the unclear endgame of the Russian military strategy in Ukraine causes serious doubts about the future of the Russian military invasion of Ukraine. On the contrary, Ukraine's military situation has never been better since the start of the war. Continued Western support, effective use of new Western supplies like HIMARS, and the willingness of the Ukrainian government, army and society to fight the war until victory has allowed Ukraine to
Fierce
capture initiative in this
defenders.
war. The full impact of this
Not letting
Ukrainian
their
advance on
land
the
go.
war overall is not yet clear. But one thing is becoming more and more clear. The Ukrainian army is getting stronger due to more and better military equipment being given to it.
It's 100%
The United States is
true.
considering giving fighter jets to Ukraine. Discussions around supplying Ukraine with ATA-CMS precision missiles with a 300-kilometer range are ongoing. Getting these weapons would give Ukraine a further advantage over the Russian army. But for now, the United States has acted carefully in terms of providing Ukraine with long-range missiles. Since
It can already be brought into discussion that it's a proxy war, which is a very strong argument there, I think. But in general, they just the US of A do not want to be brought into the war at all. But I think there's already a discussion
since
that could be
Washington
had there.
fears that this
Definitely
could
a
lead to an
debate, at least.
escalation by Russia. Thanks again to our sponsor, Established
What a
Titles.
great little roundup of the 6 months. Kings and Generals always make amazing content, always pumping it out so much as well. We love it. I'm trying to do a little binge of this series, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you haven't already, head over to their page. A link's going to be in the description box down below. And like, comment, and subscribe to my content if you're enjoying it. And I'm going to catch you in the next video.